given the fact that we are sitting here, I guess it's probably to some extent necessary to say that I spent my early childhood here in Cochin, just across the water there, and they were probably the best years of my life, because I think I just had pure fun. I think I did nothing but climb trees and catch fish and go out in the rocks looking for crabs in buckets and stuff like that. And it's hard to remember how, I mean, whether I've had that much fun for so many years together, and it was in Cochin. So it's nice to be back here in a certain way. And after Cochin, I've been pretty much living in Delhi. I've done my school there. I studied history. I did my bachelor's from Delhi University in history. I did my master's in film and television from Jamia University in Delhi. And after that, I pretty much started to work on my own. It's not that I had some inner calling to become a filmmaker. I think after finishing my history and my BA, I actually frankly looked for a course which would be a bit easy, which wouldn't have rigorous exams, which wouldn't make my life unhappy, in that sense. And looking around, I in a sense stumbled across this film course. Sounded like a easy thing to do, and so that's really, it's pure chance. That's how I got in. And after that, I did a couple of films when I finished and on my own, and then strangely, in a certain way, I guess when you're young, it really doesn't matter what you do beyond a point, and I started to feel that this was actually quite a stupid profession, to make films, and I also felt it was an extremely expensive profession. Everything would cost so much, tapes or equipment or just about, I could be interviewing somebody who, I remember I was making a film on minimum wages and accident compensation and issues in a construction site, and I remember it. I felt a bit odd, Here we were discussing what was the minimum wage, and I was actually recording an interview on a cassette that probably cost his month's wage. And I think for a bunch of reasons, I quit making films. I decided that this was the wrong profession, and I went into research with some friends in a research organization in central India, and just on whatever they were interested in and whatever research they were doing. And the research was on mining, on coal mining, and I researched on alcohol, I researched on alcohol consumption, I researched on occupational health, danger, the whole question of hazards in various kinds of mines. And I think I spent a couple of years, those 2 years were really extremely, they were tough for me, because I was entering into a world that I had no idea of. It was also the first time I was really getting an idea of what India was all about. And at the end of it, all I could say is that at the end of it, I learned a lot. I had a lot of things to say. I felt like I had a lot of things to share. And I was trying to write, trying to take photographs, and in some way I was trying to find a way to share this. And it seemed that I knew I had a medium that I had learned in a certain way, and so I kind of came back to filmmaking, went back to Delhi and restarted in a certain way. And worked independently as a filmmaker, making films on whatever subject that took my interest, and whether it was whether it was about why does the sky turn red at twilight, or I did a film like that, or whether it was a film on genetics, or whether it was a film on on occupational health, but somehow so I went back to the university where I studied. I worked independently there, and I kept working on my own for several years. And I think if there's just the only thing that I think I managed to do was somehow or the other, I stuck to making films on what I wanted to make them on, and making films in the way that I felt they should be made, regardless of whether it was the right thing to do, regardless of whether it would sell well or please somebody or not, and so on. And so almost, I think, if I remember, almost every film I made would displease some people tremendously. And at a certain point I would wonder as to, what's the matter? Every time I make a film, I upset a whole bunch of people. But I then noticed that if I was upsetting people, there were also a whole bunch of people who would emerge, who would actually be very supportive for the same film. They had a completely different point of view. And so I thought, that I must be doing something good if I'm upsetting people, and if people are supporting me in that sense as well. And I think that's pretty much, I just kept on working, and I kept working and kept working and kept making films, and that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. See, for me, there have been actually many phases, in a sense, as probably would be for everybody. And there was a period when I was trying to experiment, in a sense, or learn, in a sense, with just relationship between images and words, relationship between poetry and image, trying to share, trying to talk, trying to communicate, trying to understand in ways that were not the ways that I was taught in a sense, or not the ways that seemed to be the way to make it, in a way. But I think, and there, all along there have been, important films. There was a film that I did for the Tibetan government in exile, which became for me an important film. I think it was one of the first times when I felt quite free to do what I wanted to do. And again, a few years later, there was another film in '96 where I think in a way I had to do that film. It was a film called A Season Outside. The Tibetan film was called An Earth as Witness. There were several films in between as well, but I think around '96, '97, I felt it was important for me to, in a way, respond to the whole question of violence, and try to understand the question of violence. When I was in my final year of my BA history at Delhi University, I think by that time I was involved in a lot of social issues, political issues, as an independent, as a student. November 1984, the Sikh killings happened, and several thousand people were killed in my own city after Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated. During that entire period, Punjab was in a huge turmoil. Immediately after October-November in '84, in December, the Union Carbide gas leak happened in Bhopal. Both these events, in a certain way, for me as a student, they revealed quite explicitly the role of the police, the role of the state, the role of the political parties, and very, very apparently, it was quite clear that they were involved, they were protecting, they were allowing, or they were preventing an investigation to take place. they had participated in a crime, in a sense, in both crimes. And you saw an administration and a police and a government and a political party all pretty much working in tandem. And so I think again these two events impacted me quite a bit, in the sense that it just made me feel that I think I needed to respond, and I have pretty much therefore, for almost all the work that I've done, I felt it was necessary to respond to what was happening around me. It was necessary to engage with what was happening around me. So some of my work, for instance, much later in 2004, 2003, when I started to get to know a little bit more about the Burmese democracy movement, and I was quite upset because for instance, one of the largest military crackdowns on students took place in 1988 in Burma, and we were in Delhi. Generally we were all pretty supposedly aware and intelligent young people, but in no way were we able to actually relate or respond to such an incredibly important event that happened to students in Burma. Thousands of students fled Burma and never returned. For 25 years they never returned home from the 8th of August 1988. 5 generations of students have fought this democracy movement, and it was within the subcontinent. It was close by. It was ridiculous to have not been able to respond, to understand, to relate, to and so on. So late, yes, of course, but nevertheless, for instance, in 2003, 2004, when I started, I felt I needed to find a way to respond, and I began to film, and filmed for almost 3 to 4 years, different ways in which it's a very complex struggle, but different ways in which I could find some way to engage, to draw, to share, to understand the experience of this resistance. So at different points there have been different dilemmas that one seems to address. To try to address. There have been issues of religion, of violence, of land. A Season Outside was about understanding violence. The Torn First Pages was about the democracy movement. The Lightning Testimonies was about looking at sexual violence. And again, when Gujarat happened in 2002, we are all pretty familiar. Unfortunately, we are familiar with violence. We are familiar with brutality. My family, is from north, from Punjab. Parts of my family migrated in 47. They are familiar with violence, and I think here in Kerala, everybody has grown up with violence. But I think in Gujarat that there were moments when they pushed it to another level, and it was hard to understand how there could be some, there was a certain kind. At times there was celebration of this violence that took place in Gujarat, and I just felt that it was somehow I needed to understand. What is it that could it's hard enough to understand what is it that makes people do sexual violence or be violent to women even within a public context, but it's even harder to understand it being done in full view. It's even harder to understand it being acceptable, and it's certainly even harder to understand how it gets celebrated. So just this question as to what does it mean, it led me to make the Lightning Testimonies, and very soon I realized that actually there was, at least as far as I was concerned, I did not know how to talk, I did not know how to film, I didn't know what vocabulary to even try to understand this whole question of sexual violence. So the film, The Lightning Testimonies, essentially became about a search for a vocabulary to talk about sexual violence in political spheres, in political conflicts. And in another way, it became almost like trying to tell the history of the subcontinent, but only through the lens of sexual violence and in these public conflicts. And in every situation that you would get to, I mean, there were explanations, there were always justifications. So for the violence, I mean, okay, India, Pakistan, 1947, Hindu, Muslims, anger, religion, Muslims, Hindus, again, Gujarat, it's the same paradigm. Sometimes the explanation would be it's a period of madness. It's a reaction. It's religious conflict and so on. But then you run into a retreating Pakistani army in 1971, which is a Muslim army sexually attacking Muslim women in Bangladesh, and then this paradigm doesn't seem to work. And as you keep traveling and as you kept filming, you also realize that not everybody remembers in the same way, and not everybody archives in the same way. And so the Lightning Testimonies in a way also became about trying to find a way to talk about something that seemed so difficult to talk about, that seemed so difficult to represent, and subsequently about experiences of going beyond this, that this was not just a question of suffering, but this was a question of going beyond this suffering. In some way, maybe, I think probably I guess I have this, I keep finding myself, I think I should probably say I keep finding myself in zones of conflict again and again of one kind. The last film that I made is called The Scene of Crime. It seems closely connected to the first film that I made, and so it's very cyclical, and I felt that I was seeing, I saw crime and many kinds of crime continuing and repeating, and it just begged the simple question as to why does it continue to happen, and is the crime invisible, or is there insufficient evidence? Earlier, when in 2000, after filming in various parts of the country, different political movements, different resistances, different questions of land and agriculture and ecology and so on, I felt like everybody was just like super articulate. Everybody had their fantastic positions, everybody had fantastic arguments, everybody was trying to convince and communicate to each other, and it was like the world seemed to be full of highly articulate people, and it was quite depressing because it felt like super articulate people but nobody really listening to each other. And at that time I felt that maybe I should try to see if there's a way to cut through this super articulation and find another vocabulary. And it was very clear that, for instance, the kind of understanding that you can make or get from a poem, from just a handful of words, it was far more complex and far more deeper than the kind of understanding you would get from somebody who was explaining at great depth or arguing at great depth. And so in 2000 it led me to make a film called A Night of Prophecy, which was about poetry. It had 11 languages. I was recording poetry all across the country, and in a way trying to understand the subcontinent, trying to understand India, trying to understand what I said was that, is it possible to understand the passage of time through poetry? And because if you understand the passage of time, you can understand anything. And if you can understand the passage of time, then you have to be able to predict. You should be able to see the future. So would poetry allow me to do that? And in order to answer that question, I started to travel, and I just kept recording, not necessarily poetry from big and famous people, but poetry from just about anybody who wrote, and anything that was nice. And for me, India totally turned around. I saw a completely different subcontinent after a year of traveling, and so no prose, just only poetry. And in languages that I didn't understand, so the process of translation and so on. So there was a lot that I understood at that time. And subsequently, almost 6 or 8 years later, the last film that I've made is called The Scene of Crime, and I felt that again, you have a law. It's the law that defines what a crime is. It's a law that defines what a crime is, and it's the law that defines how you understand the crime. It's the law that defines which evidence is permissible. It's the law that defines which evidence is valid, and you are allowed to table this evidence. And subsequently, on legally defined, legally permissible evidence, a conclusion is made about the crime. And I felt this was very inadequate. We actually probably did not understand the nature and the meaning of the crime, and perhaps we needed to do two things. We needed to find another way to look at crime, and we needed another set of a different vocabulary to understand the depth and meaning of the crime. And so it brought in the question that is it possible for poetry to actually be evidence in a crime? And so would you allow me, of course you can have your forensic evidence to understand it, but would you allow me to put alongside your forensic evidence poetry as evidence formally, and would you give it some time to see if we understand the depth, the meaning, the scale, the extent of the crime that we see around us? So that's essentially where I am, and that's essentially what I think I will be showing here at Kochi, which is the sovereign forest, which contains the central film, The Scene of Crime, and a library of evidence in order to understand the scene of crime. I think it's critical to have to constantly explore newer, you may want to say alternative, you may want to say different, newer forms, methods, spaces, institutions of making work, making art, showing art, of engaging with people. I think there's been a kind of a meaninglessness that has crept in over the last few decades in the practice of making and in the practice of showing, and whether it's as individuals or whether it's as institutions. And I think this is not just a meaninglessness within the world of art, it's a larger sense as well. But it nevertheless is there within, since we're talking and since your question in a way is about looking at art contexts. I think we need to throw out or put aside several conceptions of ourselves being geniuses, of ourselves being special, of our narcissism, of our special status in a sense. I think we need to put these things aside and value the teacher, value the engineer, value the carpenter, value the there are a lot of people who do fascinating work, very interesting work, very creative work, and in many multiple spaces, engaging with people in many different ways. So I think if you are, since you're directing this query in a sense towards alternative spaces or alternative ways of making and showing art, yes, I think it's critical to push the boundary, to reinvent another space, and something like what is happening here in Cochin, I think is quite dramatic and is much needed. I'm actually very happy that it's happening here in Cochin and not happening in Bombay or not happening in Delhi. I think the kind of exhibition or the kind of biennale that is being attempted could only have happened in Kerala, could only have happened here. And in many ways it shows a way, it shows a way of trying to construct something from nothing. And I think we probably also have to just remember that this is not a form that is fixed, and maybe in 2 years' time this biennale will completely change its shape, and so it has to be seen as something fluid. Maybe instead of it being in one place, it becomes long and it disappears. Maybe it goes underground. Maybe it starts moving. Maybe it travels. Maybe I think if you don't start here, you don't go there. If you start all locked up, then you stay all locked up. So I think this is valuable and also fun. I found it quite interesting yesterday speaking to Mr. Sohan, actually, and it was Sohan, he is from Kerala, and as later when we were when I left with him on the motorcycle last night, and he said, Sohan is not it's not a name from Kerala. It's not a Malayali name. So I said, yes, Sohan. It's a North Indian name. It's a Punjabi name, actually. And then he said his father was very closely working in the north with in the freedom struggle, and was in Lahore and in 47 and so on, and he was named after a martyr by his father, he is a fascinating reservoir, in a sense that every ship that comes in carries not one but carries dozens of stories. So if they were offloading cargo or if they were loading spices, they were actually also offloading stories. And so if a ship came from Vietnam, or a ship came from China, or a ship came from and the Arab world was not Arab world. There's a lot within this kind of label, and there were many ships that were coming in from there. Each of them carried their own stories, and these were stories of the individuals inside. Sometimes there was a story that was sent deliberately, maybe 1.5, 2 years ago, for it to reach Cochin. So this space that we are sitting in, I feel, there's an official story, and whatever little that I've knocked around in the last couple of days, I'm still only getting the official story of Aspinwall, of this building, but there definitely has to be a memory of what went on here, of the experience of this empire, or of dozens of empires that kind of came together here. And for me, that is fascinating. It is fascinating to see where did the stories get offloaded, to see how they were subsequently remembered, to see what were the languages that emerged to record or to archive these memories, and subsequently what was the language that is used or became used to recall them. When I was referring to the lightning testimonies before, just making that work opened up for me. Actually, you're at the bottom of the hill, they remember in a certain way. You climb up the hill, they remember in another way. You come down on the other side, they record it in another way. Not everything is recorded in words, not everything you can touch, not everything you can see. And so if there is something that you cannot see, does it kind of reappear later? And how does it reappear later? There are memories and there are stories that are deliberately camouflaged. They are deliberately covered up, contained and buried. What causes them to what triggers them to reveal themselves, and when they do reveal themselves, do they have another appearance? Does a memory travel? When it travels, does it reincarnate? Does it wear different clothes? Does it take different names? Does it resurface in another place, looking completely different but very deeply connected to its origin? And I think this is a terrain which is not a terrain that does not exist. This is the real terrain. This is the terrain that we are living in. Even our daily personal individual existence is imprinted with maps of various kinds in ourselves, which are maps of memories. Some maps we are aware of, some maps we are not aware of, some we stumble onto, some we are following. We are absolutely following a certain map. We are on a route because of a certain map, but we are not aware that there is this map, and it's a map of memory that's inside us. And so in many ways, the process of actually discovering your own self, if it goes along with the process of discovering this landscape of memory, which is a real landscape around you, and if both these processes start to happen together, it is fascinating, it is exhilarating, it opens up another way of seeing the world and of relating, and at the moment you do that, you change. Almost instantaneously you change.